Hello, good morning, everybody. This is day 2 of our World Cancer Day conference. My name is Jackie Lockray and I'm the Education and Prevention Officer at the Pink Ladies Cancer Support Group. And guess what? It's February the 4th. It's International World Cancer Day today. So we have such a busy schedule ahead. I'm going to introduce you to Melissa Kelly, Dr. Melissa Kelly, who is going to give us some information about housekeeping and tell us all about our polls, our Twitter, our Slido, etc. So I'm going to hand it over to Melissa Kelly now. Hi, Melissa.
Hi, Jackie. Thank you so much. And welcome everybody to day 2 of World Cancer Day. We had a fantastic event yesterday, and it's so exciting that we get to do this 2 days in a row. So I'm the host of today's event. This is my 3rd year being involved with the Pink Ladies World Cancer Day event. I attended the 2nd and 3rd year of my PhD as a speaker, so it's really nice to be on the other side of the fence this time. So I'll just walk everyone through some housekeeping for today's session in case you missed yesterday's session. So we are using the Hopin platform here, and it's set up just like a real conference with the main stage, which we are on now. And we also have session rooms where we can go attend other different speakers and things like that. And we also have a lot of networking functions and interactive features on this platform, which is really exciting that we get to communicate with each other and ask questions to our speakers through the chat function. So if you look on the right-hand side of your screen, under events, you should see chat. And that's where everyone's typing in little questions. Good morning, everyone. Maybe write a little message, say where you're from if you want to, and we'll say hi back. It's just a really nice way to interact on the platform. And we also have our live Twitter feed on the right-hand side of the screen as well. So if you want to tweet at us at Pink Ladies Dairy, we can retweet your tweet and you can get to see it up on the screen here. We also have a new feature this year, which is Slido. So if you go on the right-hand side of your screen again, where the chat function is, you should see another little tab labeled Slido, and that's where we can ask you to answer some polls and some questions, some word clouds. So we're going to see if we can get one of those set up right now so you can test it out. Let me just check here. Yep, so there's a live poll going on right now. You can answer, how are you feeling today? I'm just going to type in my answer. Looking forward to day 2. Good. So it's on the right-hand side of your screen under events, and it's there should be a Q&A, a chat, and then you should see Slido, S-L-I-D-O. Fantastic. Great. So I also want to remind everyone here that this is going to be a really fun event. And I want to remind you that there's a zero tolerance policy for any misconduct or foul language using any of these chat features and interactive features. But I trust that everyone here is only here to enjoy the event. And that's exactly what we plan on doing. So if you have any questions or anything at any time, please feel free to throw them into the chat. Even if you're having technical difficulties, our team will be very happy to sort you out. So I'll hand you back to Jackie now to introduce the first session of our event.
Thank you for that, Melissa. And I really do hope that everybody participates in the Slido and the polls, etc., because it really gives us such a good feeling to see who's here and how you're feeling about today. So we're live here from the Fir Trees in Strabane, and thanks again to Johnny and all his team. They've been looking after us so well. We have been set up here in camp and we're doing so well. Thank you very much, Johnny. But yesterday, if you missed yesterday, my God, you missed such a great conference. We had so many informative speakers talking about all types of cancer research, treatment, and prevention. And I'm just going to highlight a couple of the speakers that were there yesterday. So we were introduced by the mayor of Derry, and he came on and he always shows us such great support. So he introduced the day. And first up then was Sharon O'Toole from she's a senior obstetrician down in Trinity College Dublin. She gave us such a lot of information about reproductive and gynecological cancers, information that we really did not know an awful lot about. And we heard about her great strive to introduce global charters and be part of global charters. And what we mean by that is that we have a common theme, and we can look at daring to ask questions and empower women to advocate on their own behalf in terms of cancer diagnosis. And we can join in with the global common theme on World Go Day, which is Gynecological and Obstetricians Day. The information that was coming back from that was absolutely fantastic. Then we had Dr. Mark Lawler from Queen's University in Belfast and Dr. Robert O'Connor. And one of the statistics that they told us was that there was over 100 million people missed screening in Europe in 1 year. And that just not bodes well for a cancer and cancer treatment. So there is a duty upon the government, the medical community, and obviously people in community health to really strive to get that message out about screening. Early detection saves lives, and we must encourage people to take up the screening when it's available. So that was an interesting point. We then had Joan McKeown from the Marie Curie Cancer Strategy, Northern Ireland Cancer Strategy Plan, explained this that really unbelievably we haven't had a palliative care end-of-life cancer strategy in this part of the UK. So we were the last to jump on board, and we're 10 years behind everybody else. But you know, the good news is we now do have an end-of-life cancer strategy. And we're very proud as Pink Ladies to have been part of the discussion around that. And you know, our opinions mattered, and we were able to say that we have taken part in the Northern Ireland Cancer Strategy Plan, which is going forward now. And looking at cancer prevention, we had an interesting chat with Thali Martini from Breast Cancer UK. She made us all kind of sit up and think about our relationship with alcohol and the risks that drinking alcohol pose, specifically with breast cancer. So 8% of the breast cancer diagnoses can be attributed to overconsumption of alcohol. Who knew that 3 drinks was a binge? I didn't. So there was a lot that we got from Thali Martini's presentation. And she actually suggested that alcohol is an endocrine disruptor, which is what you're going to hear a little bit more about today. And following on from that, we had Peter Loquay and Aisling Hutton from the Right Place, Right Now, Right Place, Bogside and Brandywell Health Forum are running a program that kind of works alongside what Peter was talking about in terms of a 28-day alcohol challenge, alcohol-free challenge. Peter is a trained counsellor and hypnotherapist. And bearing in mind that we heard about the risks associated with breast cancer and alcohol, we at the Pink Ladies, well, we've all signed up to do the 28-day challenge, and we really, really hope that a lot of people do sign up and take the challenge. There's a lot of support, and it really is all about changing your mindset. It's not what you're giving up, it's what you're benefiting from. And that was a key message that came out of Peter's presentation yesterday. So we were really, really delighted to be part of that. So today, what do we have in store? Today is all about cancer prevention in all of its forms. Okay, and so what do I mean by cancer prevention in all of its forms? Well, there is a lot of public health intervention regarding alcohol, regarding the risks to cancer from smoking cigarettes, from diet, from physical activity, from not eating enough fruit and veg, exposure to sun, all of those risks to a cancer diagnosis, they all have public health interventions. So any one of the cancer support groups will be able to give you information on that. We adhere to all the cancer interventions well, but we go a little bit further, and our uniqueness is that we look at the environment and the impact of chemical pollutants and the impact of air pollution and the impact of pesticides, etc., and the impact of all of those environmental toxins on our health, on human health, and also on wildlife and fish and marine life as well. So there are a group of chemicals known in the scientific community for the last 50 years as endocrine disrupting chemicals. So we have a Slido poll that we'd like to launch just to see if you have any idea what a endocrine disrupting chemical is, or have you heard about it? So I would direct you over to the Slido poll, and if you can see now that there is a question on there, and can you just type in yes or no if you've heard of endocrine disrupting chemicals before? So have we got any answers there? 50% have heard of EDCs before, which is amazing. But half of us haven't heard of endocrine disrupting chemicals either. So they are a group of chemicals that can actually interfere with the endocrine system. How I discovered them was when I had a breast cancer diagnosis myself. I was looking at ways that I could prevent a reoccurrence, and I found out that some of the chemicals used in plastics can actually encourage estrogen and mimic estrogen, which was a big no-no for me. So I kind of stumbled across these words, endocrine disrupting chemicals, and I have been following through on them ever since. And we have been campaigning and lobbying with a lot of other NGOs to try and rid the world of these endocrine disrupting chemicals. So today we're going to have a focus on cancer prevention in all its forms. You're going to see shortly a video from Rob Bilott. And Rob Bilott is an attorney who took on the chemical manufacturer DuPont in Virginia. And they found out that some of the toxic waste was flowing into agricultural land, and it was basically poisoning the land and poisoning the water. And it was, there was some, more than half of the population were experiencing cancer diagnosis and death, and wanted to have that investigated. And the film is called Dark Waters, and we'll have a listen to Rob very shortly talking about his experience of litigation and the biggest class action ever taken against a chemical company. And Rob spoke to us from the Gas Yard Féile. He spoke to the Pink Ladies from the Gas Yard Féile last year, so we were delighted to have him. We're also going to have a look and listen to Emma Pavans from Pesticide Action Network. And Emma's going to chat to us about pesticides and the use of pesticides in parks and public walkways, and what we can do as a community to encourage our local councils to stop using pesticides. The pesticide glyphosate is an endocrine disruptor, and it is one that the Education Authority do use in schools. And we are lobbying on behalf of the Pink Ladies and the our local environmental group in Derry to have that removed. And hopefully, you know, soon they will use other methods of getting rid of the weeds in schools. But a very, very interesting conversation is coming up with Emma and Donna McCluskey from the Triact Neighbourhood Management Team. We're going to have a startling conversation, I have to say, with Professor Taylor Wolffe, who is heading up a project called DECON. And DECON deals with the occupational risks of firefighters. And the firefighters are exposed to certain chemicals, chemical pollutants, both in their turnout gear and also in the nature of the fires that they are now facing. There's contaminants that are staying on their uniforms, that is being absorbed into the air, that's been absorbed around the fire stations. And we will hear from Professor Taylor Wolffe about what they are doing to encourage cancer prevention amongst firefighters. Here's a very startling statistic. 4% of firefighters are presenting with cancer, and that is totally out of sync with the 1% of the population who will experience a cancer diagnosis. So here's a group of people who who can be given information regarding cancer prevention in terms of their uniforms and how they decontaminate after fire. So fascinating chat coming up. So I really do hope that you tune in to that chat with Taylor Wolffe. We're then going to hear from Team Sorsha, and Team Sorsha from Derry have been on the forefront of campaigning for smear on demand. So if we're talking about cancer prevention, let's talk about smear on demand, where we can prevent cervical cancer in a certain age group who at the minute cannot get smears because of the age. So 25 and over are the only ones that can get smears. So below 25, you can't. They have been campaigning and lobbying for a change, and I hope the change comes soon. And you will hear from Michelle McLaren from the Pink Ladies, who will be interviewing Sarah from the Pink Ladies about her experience and her experience of a cervical cancer screening or not, or how we approach that. So it's a very unusual conversation, but one I'm really looking forward to. And we're going to end again with more cancer prevention in terms of screening. We heard the startling statistics from Dr. Mark Lawler and Robert O'Connor about missed screening appointments. Well, who better to hear from than Maria O'Connor, who is a radiographer at the Western Trust in Galvin Hospital. She is going to tell us all about the importance of screening. So we can't wait to hear about how we can improve the screening accessibility for our community. So that's just a taster of things that are coming up this afternoon. Please get involved, step in, join in the chat. Let us know where you're from, and give us some feedback on the topics that we're going to be covering this afternoon. So back to Rob Bilott, and we will be launching Rob's video very shortly. So Rob Bilott, let me just rephrase that. We had a research that came out last week from a group of scientists in Stockholm, and they were from the Stockholm Resilience Centre, and they made a very startling pronouncement, and it was: chemical pollution has passed safe limit for humanity. Well, that kind of pulled everybody up to the socks, and they were going, my goodness, is there any comeback from that? But actually there is. We haven't reached the tipping point just yet, although we're very near it. Another startling statistic is that the total mass of plastics now exceeds the total mass of living mammals. Well, that just tells you something about the state of our environment at the minute. So what's been done about it? Can we reverse it? Is it all too late? Well, Rob Bilott is actually doing something about it. And Rob Bilott is going to talk to us about two different types of chemicals. One is called PFOA and the other is called PFAS. And they're a class of fluorinated chemicals used in everything from cosmetics, from waterproof eyeshadow, to our mattresses, to upholstery. They're used as flame retardants in firefighters' uniform, hence the conversation with Taylor. They're used in food contact material. They're used in plastics. And most of these PFAS chemicals are non-essential. I'm delighted to say that the Pink Ladies have signed up to the demand for the UK chemical strategy currently being developed by the UK government, that they take into consideration endocrine disrupting chemicals. At the minute, we're protected through the Northern Ireland Protocol with the regulations from Europe under the REACH, which is the evaluator and authorizer of chemicals in Europe. So we are a little bit protected, but we want to ensure that we're fully protected after Brexit, so that we can still experience good regulation around chemical pollutants. So Rob is, we're about to see the video from Rob, and Rob tells us how he went about campaigning for people on behalf of to take DuPont to court regarding their pollutant of their area, the agricultural area, and it was the biggest class action ever seen in the United States of America. He tells us how it has taken a toll on him, his family, and his life. But he is also telling us that there is hope, that we can challenge, that we can campaign, that we can become activists. And hopefully it's a video that's going to give us some ideas about how we can challenge when we think that there is no hope and that we don't have any forms of redress. He is a living proof that we can, and that it will work if we continue to challenge the chemical companies. The PFOA is not made anymore. However, the type of chemicals that they are means that they stay forever in our environment, and they are called forever chemicals. That's the class of chemicals that they are. Forever chemicals stay forever in the environment, and a lot of them are non-essential uses of the chemical. So, we have joined forces with FIDRA, who is another NGO company in Scotland, and they are encouraging us to look at where we are using PFAS, particularly in food contact material, and seeing if we can get the government to change. So hopefully the video is queued up and ready to go.
I appreciate the opportunity to come speak with everybody, and thanks so much for watching the film. It's really, I think, incredible to see this story come out and to have the ability to have people see what this community, a small community along the Ohio River in the middle of the United States, went through for decades to get information like this out to the rest of the world. And there were some incredible people involved, not only Mr. Tennant and his family, Joe Kiger, and his family and his neighbors that really took on this issue, when it was not popular. This was one of the major employers in town, and a lot of people either worked for the factory or knew people that did. This wasn't a popular cause, but they really, persevered and sacrificed for the betterment of not only their community, but all of the rest of us, to make sure that information about this chemical that we now know is called PFOA, used in things like Teflon, that we now know this stuff has been used in so many products, in so many places all over the world for 70 years. It's not just Teflon, but it's stain resistant, waterproof clothing and carpeting, fast food wrappers and packaging, firefighting foams. Just has managed to pervade the entire planet. And as you see at the end of the film, it's not a problem that just affected one family, one farmer in West Virginia, or even just one community, or even just one country. This is a worldwide problem. This chemical is now in drinking water all over the planet, not just the United States, but in the UK. I had the opportunity to go visit the UK when the film was being released in late 2019, early 20, right before the pandemic hit. And this stuff is used in all kinds of materials throughout Europe. And it's now in the blood of virtually every person on this planet, and our children that are being born. And unfortunately, a lot was known about the problems, the toxicity, and it was covered up and it was withheld. And it took 20 years of fighting to get that information out. And, unfortunately, people like Mr. Tennant he and his wife didn't even survive to see the rest of the world finally learning about this, and finally being at the point where we can now take steps to try to protect ourselves. Most of us never had an opportunity to do anything to prevent ourselves from being exposed, because we didn't even know this chemical was out there. We didn't know it was in these products. Even to this day, if we go into a store we're not going to see this stuff on labels. We're not going to even know what products it's in. So at least information starting to come out. Regulators and scientists across the planet are starting to get the information they need to be able to start protecting people. And I was really honored to be able to have the folks at Participant Media, incredible Mark Ruffalo, who was so passionate about making sure this story came out, so that when people don't have to go through what that community went through for 20 years, when they are now hopefully able to use the science, those big studies that were done, to be able to take steps now if we find this stuff in water wherever it is on the planet. So I was really incredibly fortunate to be able to have that movie made and brought out so that people can see the power of one person standing up, speaking out, demanding that something be done, and the power of a community getting behind them, and how important it is to have a story brought out to the public in a meaningful way, not only through the court system, but through the newspapers, through media, through television, through movies, so we can reach people and let them understand what they're exposed to, why it potentially is a risk, and let them make their own choices and start protecting themselves. So sorry for that long answer, but thank you. Thanks for allowing me to be here tonight to talk about it. I was incredibly fortunate to work with Mark Ruffalo and the folks at Participant Media. I was in the middle of trials, as you saw at the end of the film, and Mark actually had read the article in the New York Times Magazine. That the lawyer became DuPont's worst nightmare, and Mark Ruffalo had been very active on water pollution issues, and when he read that story, he called me and reached out and really wanted to know how does something like this happen? How is this going on in the United States in modern times, and nobody's talking about this? Why is no media discussing this? Why does nobody know this story? What can we do to help bring this information out? And he was incredibly passionate and just a wonderful human being, and really was dedicated to wanting not only to do the story, but to do it the right way, and to really stick to the facts and show as accurately as we could what really happened, and what real people had to go through in that community with the tenants and the Keigers, and what it was like to live through that 20 years, but at the same time hoping to be able to show it in a way that helps inspire people to know it might be difficult, but it can be done, as we've been discussing. So I wanted to make sure that this was done the right way as well. I had a close relationship with the tenant family, with the Keigers, and it was incredible that they were able to I think those of you saw they were able, some of the folks were able to make cameos in the film. The Keigers were there. Unfortunately, Wilbur and Sandra had passed away, but Wilbur's brother Jim and his wife were there. We were able to do a screening of the film with the tenant family and others there in Parkersburg, because we wanted to make sure they were happy with how their family was being portrayed. And luckily we even had videotapes, depositions of Mr. and Mrs. Tennant and the others that the actors could watch, and they could actually see the mannerisms, how these individuals spoke, how they dressed, so that what you see on the screen was incredibly accurate with respect to what these people were like, what they had to go through. And I think they did an incredible job pulling all that together, taking a 20-year story and putting it into 2 hours. And so I really, I think we were incredibly fortunate to have somebody like Mark Ruffalo really be passionate behind this project and be able to team up with such an incredible group at Participant Media, and the director like Todd Haynes, and some of the amazing cast. I mean, it was incredible. And a lot of it was filmed in our offices in Cincinnati. So I got to be there and watch and help with certain parts of, how's a deposition done, and where does somebody sit, and how do they behave, and who says what. So we really tried to make it as accurate and as possible, and really show what real people had to go through. Yeah, fortunately, we know that, at least with respect to this chemical, PFOA, and the very closely related chemical called PFOS, the two that have the 8 carbons, attached to fluorine, the C8s. These are the two that are the most well known, the ones used in making Teflon, Scotchgard, firefighting foams. I know you mentioned firefighters and first responders. In the US, that's become a huge issue because those folks were using aqueous film forming foam, which is sort of a mouthful. That's called AFFF. It's a type of firefighting foam used to combat petroleum-based fires. Historically, used PFOS and had PFOA in it as well. Not only that, but the gear that firemen have been wearing historically were coated with waterproofing, stain-resistant type materials that had these materials. And because gear is so expensive and is used for so long, that stuff tends to break down and then could be in the dust of the firehouse, etc. So firemen, first responders, I'm glad that that's something that's getting a lot more attention. But with respect to the water, with PFOA and PFOS, the C8s, there's pretty effective technologies to filter it. And that requires a granular activated carbon system or reverse osmosis. They tend to be expensive for big municipal public water supplies, but they also can be very effective in capturing the C8s, the ones with these longer carbon chains. In fact, that's what's being used now in the public water supplies down in the Ohio River Valley. And they've been able to keep it down to almost below detection for the last 10, 15 years. Now, and that's also what a lot of municipalities, a lot of cities all over the world are now using to try to filter public water. There's also in-home systems that can be installed that would filter the water coming into the home if you're on a private well. Again, using that same kind of technology, but they can tend to be expensive. Not only the technology putting in the system, but then the operation and maintenance can be expensive, changing the carbon, paying to dispose of that. Now, as we have seen these newer PFAS chemicals, the ones with a couple fewer carbons, the C6s, the C4s, start to be used. We're also, as we see those being picked up in the water, unfortunately, we're finding that sometimes it may require more complicated, more expensive filtration systems. So again, luckily, in most of the places where this is being found in the water, it can be filtered out. It's expensive, but it can be done. Now, bottled water. There was just a report that came out in the United States by an organization, media group called Consumer Reports, that actually looked at a lot of the bottled water available in the US. And unfortunately, they did find trace levels, small levels, but still nevertheless there, of some of these PFAS chemicals in a lot of the bottled water. And again, it's because this stuff is so pervasive. It's really going to depend on where is the bottled water coming from. And if it's in an area that might be impacted, it's difficult unless that source is being filtered, to address that. And there's all kinds of concerns about even the packaging that this stuff is used in. So long way of saying, if it's in the public water, there are a lot of ways to filter it out. A lot of places are doing that. It could be expensive. Bottled water, it's technically some of this has been found in some of the bottled water. And there are folks that are now moving away from that, and companies that are trying to make sure that they eliminate that as well. The stuff is just very pervasive. It's everywhere. That's a terrific point, and one that I've tried to stress as well when I speak to different regulators and scientists is, we're not lab rats that can be kept in cages and bred so that we're only exposed to one chemical at a time. And unfortunately, that's the way a lot of these studies are done to look at chemical exposures and what effects they have. We're exposed not just to PFOA, but we're also exposed to PFOS, to C6s, to C9s, 10. We're exposed to all of them at the same time. And the concern is, what kind of synergistic effects do these have when we've got all of them mixing around together in us at the same time? So one of the things I think that folks are really focusing on now is we need to be looking more comprehensively at how these chemicals may be affecting us when they're all in us at the same time. And one of the other concerns too is, the 6 conditions that I mentioned that were linked to PFOA. You have to remember that science, that was all done back and finished up in 2012. It's been 10 years, almost 10 years. There's been a lot of additional science done since then, particularly looking at some of these related chemicals. And one of the things that folks are really starting to focus on is the ability of these chemicals to impact our immune system. And that's particularly scary and particularly troubling, particularly as we're dealing with the pandemic issues. Because one of the things that some of the researchers have been looking at is the ability of some of these chemicals, like PFOA, to decrease the effectiveness of vaccines, particularly in children. So if you go on the US CDC's, the Centers for Disease Control, ATSDR website, they even mention the fact that these are issues they're looking into right now. But again, nobody's really talking about that. You don't see much discussion about it. You don't see it on the news. You don't see the fact that we've got chemicals in our blood coursing through us, in our drinking water all over the planet, that may be decreasing our ability to fight off infections. You would think that would be a prime concern right now, but it's very difficult to break through and get that story out. Stories like this that are heavy on science and law and a lot of complicated chemical names, it's difficult to condense them into a 1 or 2 minute soundbite that is on social media or somebody can tweet out really quickly. Part of the problem here is these chemical names are so darn long and so confusing. It's not like arsenic, lead, things that people automatically know. You start talking about perfluorooctanoic acids or C9, C10s, and people's eyes glaze over. So finding effective ways to communicate about complicated science stories like this, particularly when there's so much at stake in our health-wise, is just incredibly important. So again, I really appreciate the opportunity to have events like this, because I think these are the kinds of discussions we all need to be having. We need to be doing it more often. Yeah, obviously we dealt a lot with the argument, oh, this is just the individual problems. They smoked too much, they drank too much, they ate too many McDonald's hamburgers, whatever the issue would be. We dealt with that in our trials when we actually were representing people that had cancer from drinking PFOA, and the company was trying to point to something else as the cause. That's almost always the argument you're going to hear. And I think, in this case, this is not like smoking, where somebody, makes a choice to pick up a cigarette, or they make a choice to pick up a hamburger, or they make a choice to eat 12 donuts, whatever the case may be. Here, none of us had a choice. None of us made this choice to be exposed to these chemicals. We didn't know we were being exposed. That information was withheld from us. In fact, much of that information is still not available. If you go on to company websites trying to figure out whether they are using these particular chemicals, because they haven't been regulated, they don't end up on a lot of warning labels. They're not necessarily disclosed. So even if you're out looking to try to find this information, you might not necessarily find it. So here, all of us were unwitting guinea pigs, where we were exposed without our knowledge, even though these companies knew, if we make this stuff and we put it out into the world, it will end up in people's blood. It's inevitable. That's where it's going to end up. Nevertheless, kept covering up this information. It wasn't until lawsuits forced this information out that this information finally comes out. But a lot of folks still don't know, even realize these chemicals are out there. But this is very different from any sort of individual choice or individual lifestyle. None of us made this choice. And most of us, even if we're trying to make choices to avoid it, we don't have the ability to do that yet because the information still isn't there. And, there are a number of companies, luckily, that are stepping forward and making very public announcements that they're no longer using these chemicals, or that they're going to switch away from them to other less, more environmentally friendly materials. But that's just beginning. So it's a difficult problem, but again, with these chemicals, it's a very different situation. None of us made this choice. None of us chose the lifestyle of PFAS exposure. Well, I think, the one thing I would recommend is don't assume somebody is going to take care of this for you. Don't assume, that just because you've got government entities, government agencies, it's as you see in the film, it's really incumbent upon each of us when we recognize a problem to bring it out and to demand that it be addressed. You can't just assume that hey, if this chemical can't be toxic, it must not be bad after all. I mean, for us, we're in the United States. Why, how could we be drinking water that's got some toxic, nasty chemicals? Certainly somebody's looked at this. No, that isn't the case. And so you've got to be prepared to insist that folks that are in positions to address public health, that they do it. And you have to be able to give them the information and the facts that they need. You can't assume that they're always necessarily going to have all of the data and all of the information. As you see in the film, and I talk about this, I wrote a book called Exposure as well, where I try to go a little more detail about what goes on between the big companies and the regulators. They're kind of the revolving door. You've got to make sure that folks that have the ability to make important decisions about public health have all of the facts and all of the data, and are not necessarily getting it filtered or spun or, in some sort of spin by somebody on the other side. You just have to take some personal responsibility to get it done and to insist that it get done. And as we saw, it may take a long time. In this case, it took almost 20 years to actually not only get this information out into the hands of regulators, into the hands of the media, the public, but to then actually get people to act on it, to be able to review it and understand it, and actually then keep pushing. We're still pushing. In the United States, despite everything we know about this one chemical, PFOA, it is still not regulated at a federal level, at a countrywide level here in the United States. Despite all that's been known, all of these health studies, all of this data, we are still having to push and fight to get legislators and lawmakers to actually act on it. And it takes the power of engaged community members, working with your media as well, to keep the story alive and not let it get buried and covered up and basically fade away into the background. Those of you who've just seen the movie, you may have seen a clip from a show that aired in the United States called 2020 back in 2003. And think about that. That was a national news story talking about this chemical and the fact that it was in everybody's blood back in 2003. And then everything kind of faded away, went back into the background, and nobody talked about it again for another 10 years. So you've got to keep the pressure on, and you've got to be able to be willing to be persistent and keep pushing those issues. I think you really have to go in with your eyes wide open to realize this is going to be a long process. And you've got to be as persistent as the chemicals. You've got to be able to really know that this is not going to be easy. It's not going to be a quick process. And it can be done, though. I mean, that's the thing I'm hoping that people can take away from watching this film. There's a documentary on the story as well called The Devil We Know that I think is still available on Netflix, but showing a lot of the real people like Bucky Bailey, who you see in the movie Dark Waters, and his mother. To really, I think the theme that I'm hoping people can take away from the story is knowing it can happen. Change can happen. We're talking about a situation here where you had the most unlikely of competitors or adversaries, I should say. A farmer in West Virginia raising cattle who was able to take on one of the biggest corporations on the planet, and actually got not only was able to get this information out, but we were able to actually get the science confirmed. This is something, again, I address in the book a lot more detail. Unfortunately, and at least in the United States, in our legal system, the burden is on the exposed person to have to prove whether an environmental exposure like this is causing you harm. The company doesn't have to come in and prove it's safe. They can simply sit back and say, you haven't proven it. You don't have enough science. What you saw in this film was this was one of the only times where a community was able to get together and actually get the science done, get massive studies done. And yeah, it took a long time. It took a long time. It took a lot of people coming together, 70,000 people. But nevertheless, it can be done. And it happened. And we were able to actually, because of that, get the laws changed. We're actually seeing laws being proposed now, not only in the United States, but internationally, to ban some of these chemicals, to restrict their use, to change public policy. And again, it's because people were insistent on making sure this happened. They didn't simply sit back and say, oh, we lost this particular court battle, or, oh, this is going to take 2 or 3 more years. Knowing we may have setbacks. There may be, we may take 2 steps forward and then 3 steps back, but eventually you get to that goal line. And here, I think, hopefully when people see this film, they realize it can happen. It happened here and it can happen again. People can make a huge change, no matter how huge the odds and how big your adversary, it can be done. Yes, it is continuing and is likely going to just expand as we find out that these chemicals have been used in so many different operations. And the sampling is just really beginning across the United States, looking for these chemicals in the water. And then now different people are trying to figure out where's it coming from. And so I think what you're going to see happen is a lot of additional sites, a lot of additional contamination areas are being identified. We actually have brought a new case at the end of 2018. I actually brought a case where we are seeking to represent everyone in the United States that now has PFAS chemicals in their blood. And the goal is to try to do, as you saw in the film, we set up this science panel to confirm what the health effects of this one chemical, PFOA, are. We did it through an independent panel that was confirmed, and people were able to then go forward and understand what those health effects are. Now, as we realize it's not just PFOA, but it's PFOS, it's Gen X, it's all of these C4s, C6s, C8s, 9s, 10s, all of these additional PFAS are out there. And as we're discovering them, We're hearing the companies say the same things we heard when PFOA was being discovered. Well, there's no evidence. There's no science showing that these cause any harm. You don't have any data to show this is a problem. Well, the idea is, well, if you're going to continue to make these chemicals and put them out there and use all of us as guinea pigs, you companies should pay for the independent scientists to do the studies to tell us what they're doing. So we're pursuing that case right now as well. We're waiting to find out whether we can proceed on behalf of the entire exposed population in the US. So I see these continuing. And as every day we're seeing this pop up, not just in the US, but in other countries as well. There's been a major PFAS contaminations identified in Belgium, in all kinds of firefighting foam problems in Australia, in New Zealand. There's PFAS contamination in the drinking water in Italy, in Germany. So it's everywhere. And I'm trying to do what I can to help make sure people have access to the information and the science about what we know, so that people aren't going to have to go back, start all over and redo all of this, that we can move forward based on what we already know, no matter where in the world this comes up. Thank you so much. Yeah, this was a tremendous opportunity, and those are terrific ideas. To have folks that can understand the chemistry, and I'd always recommend read the stuff yourself, read the facts, read the data yourself. Don't let somebody else interpret it for you or tell you what it means. Look at the data, look at the facts, form your own conclusions. So thank you so much for the opportunity to speak to everybody tonight. I really appreciate it. Thank you for watching the film, and I hope you will continue discussing this story. And it's a story that affects all of us. We're all in the same boat with this stuff. And thanks so much. I really appreciate it, and hope you have a good evening.
Well, folks, sobering information from Rob Bilott, I think. But how powerful, how articulate, and just an amazing activist and campaigner. Just one of the things, one sentence or one slogan that came out for me was, be as persistent as the chemicals. Be as persistent as the chemicals. Well, there'll be nobody more persistent, let me tell you, than the Pink Ladies Cancer Support Group. If a farmer from the US of A can challenge, then certainly a cancer support group can challenge, and we certainly will challenge, and we certainly will be on there putting our tuppence halfpenny worth in with the 12 asks of the chemical strategy. And he is so inspiring, so inspiring. And folks, I'll tell you, we're going to meet somebody else who is equally as inspiring, who is doing something. We just don't do nothing. We have to do something about this. We can't just sit there and say, oh, that's what's happening, so we can't do anything. I'm going to introduce you now to, I'm going to read out her bio, because I would never do it justice with just reading it off or just saying it. But Taylor Wolffe is a postdoctoral research associate working at the Centre for Fire and Hazard Science at the University of Lancaster. Her background is in environmental health and evidence-based, which is what Rob was talking about, chemical risk assessment. Taylor's current research interests center around the occupational health of firefighters. Again, you heard Rob talking about how exposed the firefighters are. In particular, Taylor's work focuses on tackling the increased incidence of cancer among the firefighting population, characterizing links between cancer diagnosis and occupational exposure to toxic fire effluent. Working in collaboration with the Fire Brigade Union, big shout out to Jim Quinn from the Fire Brigade Union in Belfast, who has encouraged some of the chiefs to allow their personnel to have a look at the next section coming up. Her research aims to provide an evidence base from which to devise effective interventions aimed at protecting firefighters' health. So without further ado, I'd like to introduce you to Taylor Wolffe. Hello, Taylor.
Hi, Jackie. Thank you for that introduction.
Oh, you're very, very welcome. I just chatted with you there to see if you had heard Rob's talk.
Yes. Oh, very interesting and very inspiring. Definitely.
Good.
Yeah.
Good. So you're inspiring as well because you're doing some of this research, startling statistics about firefighters. I mean, what is it? So 4%, 4% of the 10,000 that you use as a cohort group had cancer diagnosis.
Yeah, that's right. And what's more alarming, I think, is how young the firefighters who were diagnosed with cancer were. I'll go into it a little bit more in a presentation that I have prepared, but it's shocking, really.
It is shocking. It is shocking. And what is more shocking is it is actually preventable. Do you know what I mean? So the things that you are now researching and the information that you're giving to the firefighters is that there is something that they can do about this. And this is what the whole Decon project is about. So lovely. Dive right in with your slides. Dying to hear what you have to say about it. So let's go.
Great. Thank you. So yeah, this is just a presentation to give you a bit of an overview of the project that we have running at UCLan, working in collaboration with the Fire Brigades Union. So I thought I'd just jump straight into it to talk about the key motivator behind the research that we do. And unfortunately, that is that firefighters are suffering from cancer. And they're suffering from cancer at a relatively young age compared to the general population. The link between firefighting and cancer is something that's been repeatedly found across the globe for several different types of cancers. And the reason we think firefighters are suffering more cancer is because they are exposed to harmful carcinogenic substances as part of their job. So fires produce a lot of pretty nasty substances in terms of toxicity, and many of those are suspected or proven human carcinogens. And this link between firefighting and cancer has been so confidently established that in the US, for example, there are some states that actually have presumptive legislation in place that protect firefighters' right to things like workplace compensation or medical support should they develop cancer in their lifetimes. But when we turn to the case of the UK firefighter, there's relatively little in place to protect UK firefighters' health and relatively little research available on UK firefighters. There are a few older studies here and there which look at things like the rates of cancer in UK firefighters, but there's very much a lack of up-to-date evidence concerning UK firefighters. And this is a problem for a few reasons. The first is that calls for action, essentially calls for workplace compensation, for health screening, all of firefighters' personal lived experience of cancer, their accounts of cancer, all of that is very easily dismissed because there's no documented evidence that we can point to, or hard scientific evidence, if you like, recorded evidence that we can point policymakers to. And actually, we've seen this recently with the Industrial Injuries Advisory Council, who failed to recognize cancer as an occupational hazard for firefighters. And one of the key reasons they gave for that was a lack of evidence for UK firefighters and a high level of discrepancy they cite between evidence from other countries and the UK. It also impacts awareness of the issue, not just within fire and rescue service itself, but in other fields which directly impact firefighters' lives. So the medical profession, for example, and in government. And again, this really compromises firefighters' access to timely help, which in the case of cancer is a particular issue because early intervention is really key for successful treatment. But finally, this lack of evidence, so to speak, can make it kind of hard to prevent the issue in the first place because we don't necessarily have that hard documented evidence to guide us toward which measures are going to be most effective in terms of reducing risk of cancer in firefighters. So at UCLan, that's essentially what we are working on. We are trying to get moving on all of this and gather that hard evidence that we need. We're analyzing data and looking for trends, and we're publishing our findings so that not only can the likes of policymakers access that information, but firefighters themselves have access to this information, and they are ultimately the key stakeholders of this project. So there are a few specific aspects of the project that I'd like to talk about today. And they are our National Firefighter Contamination Survey, which we ran back in 2020, our best practice decontamination guidance, and the UK Firefighter Cancer and Disease Registry, which is quite a big important one, which I'll touch on toward the end. But before I kind of get into all of that, I thought it might be helpful to just emphasize why we're so concerned about exposure to these toxic substances. And to do that, I thought we might have somewhat of a toxicology lesson, if you like. So one of the key principles of toxicology is the concept of a dose. So the amount of something that you're exposed to, be that through inhalation, so breathing it in, ingestion, so inadvertently swallowing a substance and it getting through to the digestive tract, or dermal exposure, so your skin coming into contact with something toxic, or a mixture of all of those different exposure pathways. And there's a saying in toxicology, which is the dose makes the poison. And it's essentially just meant to convey the idea that the amount of something you're exposed to determines how much harm it's going to cause you. So you can have something that's really very toxic, but if you're never actually exposed to it, then you're going to be fine. Don't worry. But similarly, you can have something that's pretty non-toxic, say water even. And if you're exposed to a very large quantity of that, that can do you a fair bit of harm. So it's just that concept of controlling the dose of these substances that we're exposed to, which helps us to manage risks, especially in scenarios like fire incidents, because at a fire incident, we have relatively little control over how toxic the substances being produced are. We don't have much control over what's burning and the composition of the fire effluent that's produced. So the least that we can do is control the amount of that we're exposed to. And we can do that through wearing PPE, wearing breathing apparatus, that kind of thing. But things get a lot more complicated when we consider chronic health effects like cancer and the dose of carcinogens that firefighters are exposed to. In toxicological terms, cancer is a bit more complicated. It's not an acute illness with one clear mode of action. You're not going to go into a fire incident, come out a couple of hours later and have cancer. It can take years for cancer to develop, and relatively very small biological changes in your body, the dysregulation of a single cell, say, to start that process of developing cancer off. And because of how complex it is, and how those very small, very subtle changes in your body can play a part in cancer, regulatory agencies who assess the risk of exposure to toxic substances generally consider there to be no safe dose for carcinogens. And what's more, if you're repeatedly exposed to even very small doses of carcinogens, that just makes your chances of developing cancer even more likely. And that's essentially why we're concerned about contamination in particular, about these low doses of these toxic substances. Fire incidents are a very obvious source of exposure to toxic substances. We can see the smoke, we can see the debris, in a way that makes it easier to control for by wearing things like PPE, breathing apparatus, etc. But what's far less obvious often, because we just can't see it, and therefore it's pretty easy to miss, are those much smaller doses of contaminants that settle out from the smoke and debris and settle on PPE, on appliances, on skin, hair, etc. And as we've just learned, it only takes a very small amount of those substances or repeated exposure to small amounts of those substances to cause cancer. So here at UCLan, we are interested in firefighters' occupational exposure while they're attending fire incidents, but we believe that contamination is an issue that deserves special attention for the reasons just discussed. And it's not necessarily the first thing you might even think of as an occupational exposure for firefighters, but there is actually a large body of growing evidence which finds high levels of these contaminants are tracked back to fire stations, remain on firefighters' PPE for some time. And so they very much are a part of firefighters' everyday exposures, whether they've attended an incident that day or not. At UCLan, we've done some of this work ourselves. We've run a testing campaign in UK fire stations, and we similarly found high levels of carcinogenic contaminants in all areas of fire stations, even in areas that would otherwise be considered clean, so things like offices and dorm rooms, etc. So we wanted to understand what those sources of contaminants were and what we could do about it, how we can protect firefighters from receiving exposure to those contaminants. So we ran a survey back in 2020, and we invited all currently serving UK firefighters at the time to take part. The survey had 64 questions, and it was just designed to assess firefighters' potential sources of exposure to contaminants and the health consequences of those exposures, as well as to provide firefighters with an opportunity to voice any concerns or thoughts they might have on the issue of contamination. And what we found while analysing the results of that survey was that 4%, or just over 4% actually, of serving firefighters had already developed cancer. That's serving firefighters, not including retired firefighters. And younger firefighters, so people in their 30s, were generally developing cancers at a rate that normally you'd only see for people in their 50s plus in the general population. We also found that very few firefighters had actually received any kind of cancer screening. Of those that did, the majority had received the standard age-related cancer screenings that are offered to everyone through the NHS, whether you're a firefighter or not. And obviously that's concerning, given that we were finding much younger firefighters being diagnosed with cancer who weren't even meeting the age brackets for these cancer screenings yet. And also that there is no current requirement for firefighters to receive any kind of special cancer screening based on the job that they do. And finally, we found that several bad practices, if you want, for want of a better word, I suppose, practices essentially that would increase your exposure to contaminants were still quite prevalent in the UK Fire and Rescue Service. These were things like, for example, eating while wearing your PPE, failing to keep clean and dirty PPE separately, so storing them separately, for example, re-entering the appliance cab after an incident in fully contaminated PPE, so not changing before jumping back into the appliance cab. And we did actually find that 16% of survey respondents still believed that visibly contaminated PPE was somewhat of a badge of honour, so a proof of hardworking nature. So we're still preparing our findings on that survey for publication. So we're in the process of finalising all of that right now. But our preliminary analyses also found that respondents who tended to engage in those bad decontamination practices, if you like, or worked in stations that didn't have very good decontamination practices in place, they were significantly more likely to develop cancer, in some cases twice as likely to develop cancer. So what can we do about that? How can we take those findings forward and make sure that firefighters get the protection that they need from contaminant exposure and from developing cancer? Well, one place we can start is by agreeing on best practice for decontamination procedures. And that's essentially the role of this document here. So this is a best practice guide for adopting decontamination procedures in UK Fire and Rescue Services, which was produced in collaboration with the Fire Brigades Union as part of the Decon campaign. And you can find it at this link over here. So this guide was produced using the data that we'd collected from that survey, from data from indoor testing campaigns that we'd run that I mentioned earlier, but also from a process of reviewing the scientific literature, seeing what people in other countries do, and gathering together all existing decontamination procedures from all of the UK Fire and Rescue Services and kind of comparing what works best, etc. So there is a load of good information in there. If you want to check it out, there's also quite an extensive bibliography. So if this is something that you're very interested in and want to read up further on, then I would recommend checking it out. But what about firefighters who are currently suffering from cancer or who will suffer from cancer in the future as a result of the exposures that they've received at work now or have received at work years before these decontamination procedures might come into place? And how can we make sure that these decontamination procedures are actively reducing cancer, are effective? Well, that's where our cancer and disease registry comes in. So at UCLan, we've set up this database. You can find it at the link that I've pasted on screen there. And it's essentially just a database which keeps a record of firefighters' own personal accounts of their workplace exposures and the potential health outcomes that have resulted from those exposures. We're very eager for any firefighters, serving or retired, to join the registry. And it really doesn't matter if you don't have cancer or you don't have a particular disease, but we really want any firefighters, healthy or otherwise, to join the registry. What it looks like to anyone who's wanting to join it is essentially like a survey, just a questionnaire. And so we asked lots of questions about workplace exposure, about health conditions, and you just simply have to fill it in your own time. You can save it, come back to it at any point. And we also have the capability to link the survey responses that are provided to GP records, if that's something that participants consent to. Don't have to consent to that. And I should just also mention that all the data is obviously kept strictly confidential and secure. The only people who have access to it are a very limited number of people on the UCLan research team, and they would only ever publish findings in an anonymized way. So this information, I should stress, is not shared with employers. It's not shared with the fire brigades union. No one else has this information. Now, joining the registry is really important because it's essentially a living account of the health of the UK Fire Service. It literally provides that documented hard evidence that I said we were so lacking for UK firefighters. It's the evidence that we need to approach government, for example. It's the evidence we need to effect change. And it's a tool that we hope to use to get firefighters regular cancer screening in the future, or to get them things like legal compensation for any disease or cancers that they suffer as a result of their work. It's evidence, essentially. It also allows us to identify trends earlier. So, for example, if we start noticing that firefighters who attended a certain type of incident have all come down with a particular type of cancer, this is something you'll find anecdotally amongst firefighters a lot, where, you know, someone who diagnosed with a usually quite rare kind of cancer knows of many others on their watch similarly diagnosed with the same type. Well, we can start looking at those trends, and we have the hard evidence if they're in the registry, and we can, you know, put interventions in place. Maybe there are extra precautions we need to take for certain types of fires. Maybe we need to look at what the specific toxic agent in those fires might be, etc. So that's also why it's so important for us to also have healthy firefighters fill in this registry, because, you know, we need comparison groups as well. We need to also be able to monitor these trends over time. So we need to see if those firefighters continue to stay healthy, if they develop cancer. It's just another piece of evidence, essentially. And we can use that as well to assess whether decontamination procedures are continuing to remain effective. So by joining the registry, firefighters are essentially looking out for each other's health and for the health of future firefighters. So that was just a very brief overview of the kind of research that we're conducting at UCLan, a kind of a plea to join the firefighter registry. And I just wanted to wrap up by kind of briefly mentioning what the future research plans are, where we're going to be taking this cancer and disease registry in the future. So we're at the moment busy planning a campaign of biological testing for firefighters. So this would involve taking, for example, blood and urine samples and analysing them to actually find what kind of contaminants have made it into the bodies of firefighters and what kind of levels we're finding in firefighters. And that will just give us that link that we need, that causal link between exposure and health outcome, because it proves that not only are you exposed, but they have actually made it into your body and they are likely causing these health effects. It's just another piece of evidence that we need to effect change. It really strengthens our case. We're also hoping to pilot a health screening or cancer screening campaign where we're going to screen a small number of firefighters for markers, early markers of disease and of cancer. And this will really just help us to identify biological markers that we need to be monitoring in firefighters, help us to devise a set of testing that is specific to firefighters, and allows us to identify these cancers at an early enough stage. So in a way, it's no good sending for firefighters for testing if we're not looking at the right things. So it's really important that we document all of this evidence. So I would recommend looking out for this research in the future. It's progressing at the moment. I will leave it there, though. I've put our contact details up. Professor Anna Steck, who's the lead on this project, details there, my details, and of course the Firefighter Cancer and Disease Registry. If you have any questions that I'm either not able to answer today, or you think of to ask later, or you just want some more information on anything that I've said, then we're more than happy to hear from you. So thank you very much for listening.
Anna and Taylor, I mean, unbelievable the work that you have done. Unbelievable. I know we invited Professor Anna Steck on as well, and she's actually talking, I think, or she's producing evidence for the Grenfell inquiry. Would that be right?
That's right. Yes. Yeah.
So thank you so much for coming and explaining that in such detail. Just absolutely fascinating. Couple of questions that have come in. We do have some firefighters on here, but here's a question for you. You happy enough to take questions, Taylor?
Yes. Oh, yeah.
Okay. When thinking about cancers, would findings show a significant difference between part-time firefighters and full-time firefighters? I know I think I'm right in saying that the Northern Ireland Fire Brigade is made up mainly 70% of on-call firefighters. So, what's the significance of that in terms of the research that you're doing?
So this is a really good question, because we found a potential link between not having access to decontamination facilities or being more likely to go home without decontaminating first and being diagnosed with cancer. When we take all the results together across the whole of the UK and adjust for age, we didn't seem to notice a very significant difference. But that's not to say that in Northern Ireland in particular, for example, that wouldn't be the case. So that's definitely something we can refine our results and look at further. But just to say that any situation where you're not heading back to a station, showering, decontaminating at workplace, coming home completely decontaminated, then you probably are going to run a higher risk of exposing yourself for longer and also potentially exposing family at home.
Very worrying. We have James Patterson. He is from the Newry Fire Station, and he has posted a question. Hello, James. Really delighted that you can join. He has said that it was a very informative talk, and thanks you very much for it. His question is: has Taylor any plans to conduct her research in Northern Ireland?
So we need firefighters from Northern Ireland to join the registry. At the moment, we have 77 serving firefighters from Northern Ireland on our registry and 27 retired. So I think that's about 4.5% of the Northern Ireland firefighting population. So we could definitely do with some more.
I'll happy to help with that. Definitely happy to help with that. Mm-hmm.
So that would be one way of us essentially conducting research in Northern Ireland. And we can, when we have a larger sample size from Northern Ireland as well, we can on request look into specific trends that are relevant to Northern Ireland.
So we need to have definitely a campaign of awareness, raising awareness, particularly for just to register for the cancer registry in the first instance.
Yes, that is the first, I would say, kind of point to being involved in this research.
We had another one. Helen Lynn has just said, much needed research from UCLan. What are the regulations needed to prevent this exposure from happening in the first place to prevention of cancer?
Yes, that is a complicated question. You could argue that really we should be regulating what the materials in products in houses, in residential fires, in industrial fires are, right? So in recent times, there's been a massive increase in the number of synthetic chemicals that are in everyday products, and they burn far more toxically, basically. And that's something that is overlooked in regulation. So you'll find regulation for direct exposure to additives in everyday products, but no one considers how those additives change once they're burnt. No one considers how toxic the effluent is from those components when they burn. It's a horrendously under-regulated area. And that's actually an area of Professor Anna Steck's work as well. She's done a fair bit of research into that. So she'd be someone to contact about that.
I suppose we know about the flame retardants in mattresses and upholstery and cars, so they are spraying typically PFAS type chemicals in those areas. Any flame retardants or PAHs or whatever. Do you know what I mean? They're just being used more extensively. And I was going to ask you that, is the classifier different now in the last 50 years, which is why this is presenting this problems, obviously because of the synthetic chemicals that are now in all of the products. So I understand that. Is there any particular types of cancer that are coming to the fore with firefighters? You know, is there any ones in particular that these chemicals are causing?
Well, cancers that we found were most common when we surveyed firefighters were skin cancer was by far the most common. When you compare that to the most common cancers in the UK, skin isn't that high up there. So we think that's definitely dermal exposure that's playing a large role. When I kind of talk about my work to anyone else, people often assume it's lung cancer that firefighters are going to be suffering from because they imagine the smoke and breathing in the smoke. But actually, PPE like breathing apparatus should account for those exposures, and we're actually finding that lung cancer isn't as high up there as people might expect. It's skin, testicular, head and neck cancers as well. Suspect from contact with fire hoods potentially. Non-Hodgkin's lymphoma is up there, prostate, kidney, bladder, leukemia, and also we tend to see kind of rarer cancers I've never even heard of. We'll have respondents telling us about. And yeah, when you compare that, I think the most common cancers in the UK generally are breast, lung, prostate, and bowel cancer. So you can see there's a big difference in the type of cancers that we're seeing for firefighters. And I mean, maybe if we were in Australia or somewhere like that, I'd say, sure, it's probably exposure to the sun, but I'm not sure it is in the UK.
And even at that, you know, the skin cancer, you're more likely to see it on your skin. So you're more likely to present to your GP with something that's physically there that you can't see with the skin cancer.
True.
But thyroid and prostate are just not, you know. Very interestingly, Taylor, we had a motion to the Northern Ireland Assembly. It was a very emotional motion that was passed, but we don't know what's become of it. We were hoping to have somebody come from the Northern Ireland Assembly and just explain what happened. But anyway, there was a motion put by David Hilchard, who is a serving firefighter who is terminally ill from cancer, and his son, who was also a firefighter, who died. And the motion was demanding annual screening for firefighters, annual health screening for firefighters and their families. Now, I suppose when you listen to the conversation that we had with Dr. Mark Lawler and Robert O'Connor yesterday from the Irish Cancer Society and from Queen's, screening is what people are not doing. You know, they are missing their screening. They're missing their screening appointments. We're facing an endemic of cancer down the road anyway because people are missing the screening appointments. But I think here we have a cohort of people that cancers are entirely preventable. If we were screening them specifically, that's 4% of the population that doesn't have to enter into the NHS. And you know, because there is a problem with the pathway at the minute and getting through, seeing your GP and treatment and everything else. So if you can prevent that and stop that, you know, the money that you're saving in that respect compared to what it's going to cost to treat a cancer and the financial implications for you and your family and the physical and mental, you know, trauma that you go through, and you're in the system for the rest of your life. I mean, this is entirely preventable if we can get the screening specifically, and also if we can raise awareness with the firefighters about what they can do themselves to prevent a cancer diagnosis.
Yeah, definitely. You know, decontamination procedures, these are all things we can do now that can be implemented relatively quickly and easily. You know, I appreciate that demanding annual cancer screening, while is vital, but is probably something that's going to be a little bit more of a fight, a little bit more lengthy. But certainly, you know, things you can be doing now, definitely look into decontamination, look at the fire brigades unions, decon training. You know,
Yeah.
Okay.
Another question here from Helen Foley. Would you say it was lack of resources that prevented them from changing, or an unawareness of the risks?
So we do have another paper which looks at this issue, and I'd say it's probably a mixture of both, which is maybe not the most helpful answer. So you'll find that there are still firefighters who believe, that decontamination is against this kind of badge of honor mentality. So you will find that, and when we asked survey respondents, to be honest, the majority said that they personally didn't believe that, but they felt that their colleagues did. And we actually noticed that just thinking that your colleagues did seemed to have an effect on your own behaviors, whether that be via peer pressure or because we had a question, for example, where we asked whether you would ever attend an incident without wearing your breathing apparatus. And a key reason that many firefighters who said that they would gave was that, well, no one else wears it. Or,
well, no one else wears it. Is that what they say? Oh.
Yeah, or I'd get sick because, someone else, the rest of the bush doesn't wear it or whatever.
Yeah.
And so there is a kind of cultural aspect to it, but then, that's not uniform across all fire and rescue services. You'll find others that that will tell us that simply the resources weren't available until really recently. There's some evidence from that survey that any kind of training on health effects of exposure to contaminants has not really been available until maybe 0 to 4 years before we ran that survey. In fact, 62% of the firefighters that we surveyed hadn't received any kind of training at all on the issues of exposure to contaminants. It was also worth mentioning that of those that hadn't received any training, 98% of them were willing to receive that training, would say they would find it useful. So I do think it's a little bit of a mixture of both, kind of lack of resource, lack of knowledge of these risks, and then also there's still somewhat of a cultural element, I think, that needs to be tackled.
But I think it must be changing. It must be changing because they're obviously concerned about the high levels of cancer that they're experiencing. They're recognizing that themselves, and they have to see that there's a connection between their behaviors, I suppose, and the cancers that are now prevalent in younger people, so and younger firefighters. So it's not their behavior and their lifestyle choices outside of being a fire person. It's within the fire, crew and their attitudes as well in the station. Martin Mullen has said the pandemic has also people trading behind possible important checkups and maybe not understanding about the backlog that awaits the doctor. That's again is a problem. So particularly if you can see that you have a physical ailment, as in the skin cancer, you can go, but if you don't know, you're not going to know until the end, I suppose. Taylor, it has been just an absolute pleasure. We're running out of time here. Fascinating, and I think a very important part of the research. It ties in beautifully, I think, with what Rob Bilott has been saying, and ties in with what the message that we are trying to get across as a cancer support group. It has to be about education. It has to be about raising awareness. We can't just keep pointing at what we've always said: alcohol, smoking. Whilst they have their place as behavioral and lifestyle choices, we have to be identifying and looking at environmental toxins, and particularly when we've got such a small group in an occupation that that again is entirely preventable, that we can do something about. Then it's fascinating, and whatever the Pink Ladies can do to help raise awareness around this campaign, we will do. So the ticker tape has been running the cancer registry across the bottom. So hopefully some of the fire personnel that have been watching this will get on and register, and we'll certainly follow that up as well. And we'll keep our eye on this motion to the Assembly to see what they intend to do about the annual screening. But can I just say again, a massive thank you so much for coming here today and explaining all of this. Thank you very much, Taylor.
Thank you.
You're welcome. We're going to go back now to Melissa. I'm going to get Melissa back on screen. Hi.
Hi, Jackie.
Fascinating, wasn't it? It was just
I was writing notes the entire time. Such an interesting talk.
Yeah,
And
very interesting talk.
yeah.
So,
So presentation as well.
Back over to yourself then.
Yep.
What's next on the agenda?
So next on the agenda, we're going to be breaking for our tea break very shortly, but I just wanted to do a few more Slido polls before we do break. So if you go to the right-hand side of your screen again, to the Slido tab, you should see a new poll up that says, how concerned are you about harmful chemicals and endocrine disrupting chemicals? We want to get a kind of a feel for what everyone's thinking right now after these two incredible talks that we had. So if everyone can just enter their answers, we can start seeing what the results are. Very concerned and quite concerned. Yeah, that's usually how people feel as well. I spent a lot of my PhD doing research with the general public, explaining to them what endocrine disruptors are and getting a bit of their feedback. And it's always a bit overwhelming when people hear about this first. It can be quite concerning because we place so much trust in our government, in organizations and regulations, that it's quite frightening to see that we're probably not being as taken care of as we would like to be. And this is usually a lot of new information to throw at a person. So I think we might have one more poll after this one. Just make sure that you're using Slido on the right-hand side of your screen under the Events tab. And let's see if we have another one. If not, that's fine. Let me just see. But yeah, that was a great discussion between Jackie and Taylor. So fascinating. And we were very lucky to have some firefighters listening as well. So that's very exciting. So we have another poll here, which is, what are your main concerns? So from everything that we just heard, what would be the main thing that you would be kind of concerned about or worried about or anything like that? Just pop your answer into the poll. We'd love to know where everyone's head's at and what everyone's thinking. I'm just answering the poll here myself. Chemicals. So we need to remember that not all chemicals are bad. I think a lot of people have a negative stigma with regards to chemicals. Chemicals help us a lot. The entire world is made up of chemicals. Water is a chemical. So we don't need to be concerned about chemicals. We just need to be concerned about specific chemicals that might be increasing our risk to a number of negative health effects like we just spoke about today. Exposure to these chemicals, endocrine disrupting chemicals, lack of regulation, that's what I'm most concerned about. Unknown chemicals. Yeah, so some very interesting responses here. And so that wraps up our morning, or the first of our morning sessions today. We're going to take a quick 15-minute tea break. So stretch your legs, get a cup of coffee, a cup of tea, have a snack, and we'll be back at 11:45. And you should hear the Pink Ladies countdown again when we're about to begin. And we'll be back with Emma from Pesticide Action UK. And that discussion will be facilitated by Donna from Triax in Derry. So looking forward to that session, and we will see you all very soon.